Hello and welcome to Android Developers Backstage. I'm Tor Norbye from the Android Developer Products team.
I'm Dustin Lamb. I'm a software engineer working on KMP.
And I'm Yigit Boyar. I work in the Android Toolkit team.
Are you going to introduce your dog? Or?
Oh, this is Polly. This is our guest dog. Not my dog. My dog is very jealous right now.
I can imagine. All right, so we're going to talk about KMP. What does KMP stand for?
It stands for Kotlin Multiplatform. It's actually kind of weird that it's its own product name. I don't know. I have a little rant about this.
You've come to the right place.
Yeah, I don't know. Like it's actually just Kotlin plus now they have more compilers, so it can compile to other platforms. But really, it's just on top of existing Kotlin. So it's like kind of like Kotlin plus multi-platform, not really a whole new product. Like React Native is like its own product, you know. But
so is it a language dialect, or is it a set of libraries, or
it's the same language. It's usually actually for the most part it's sometimes the same libraries, but it's not like a whole different technology or a different language or anything. It's just not everything is supported in other platforms, so you're working with like a subset, but it's Kotlin plus multi-platform, not really like its own totally separate stack or anything like that.
I think actually like that's interesting. Since the early days of Kotlin, I think it's like before 1.0, they also compiled to JavaScript or transpiled technically. So Kotlin was always multi-platform, but basically the Android community took it over. It became popular, and the line between what is a Art Android runtime API versus what is a Kotlin API is like it's not very clear, and also they're all Java APIs.
But it felt like in the early days of Kotlin, it was also very deeply tied to Java interoperability, right?
Yeah.
So like your list was really a Java util list.
Correct.
And that doesn't work well in JavaScript, right? Whereas I have a feeling that KMP has tried to formalize this a bit more, right? Where the APIs are no longer sort of assuming a Java binding. Is that correct?
I think that's correct. But the goal is, so KMP takes a different approach than, let's say, React Native or Flutter, where like in React Native, you run a JavaScript engine, whichever platform you are running. So it's the same JavaScript engine, it's the same code. For Kotlin, if you are running on Android, if you have a Kotlin list, just actually Java util list. But if you are running on the web, it is another one. Like it is I think it's their arrays. I don't know if they back them by arrays. So it's actually whatever is proper for that platform.
It's really good for interoperability because it's really native.
Yeah. But it does have, it creates concerns. Maybe we'll talk about them later.
Yeah, let's not start with the concerns.
Yeah.
So what's the pitch for KMP?
Well, maybe Yigit should go, unless you think I should. But for me, I think it's the pitch for who? I think that's the question. Is it the pitch for why is Google doing this? Like why is the effort for KMP valuable in general? Why is it valuable for Android developers? I think.
Well, I think for our listeners and viewers, it's probably a lot of Java developers and Android developers, right? So people who are like, I'm already writing Android apps. Why should I care about KMP?
So Yigit actually had a really nice couple slides for this last year in KotlinConf, and he talked a little bit about like how doing and investing in Kotlin multi-platform can actually benefit Android and Java developers. It's not just Android or KMP. It's kind of like the unison of them together makes Android development better as well. And part of that is maybe this is a touchy topic to talk about, like job market and like how the longevity of things like native Android development in the current job market, but also making the stack that we know able to be used on other platforms extends that skill set. So that's one of the things that's nice. The other thing is, so for Android development, like we have a pretty large
Here's the thing, KMP So we need to be realistic about the job market, right? Like every company tries to improve their return on investments by developing an Android application or a web application. You're making an investment and you expect certain returns from it. Now, the challenge is we already know for the best way to write Android applications are to use Android native toolkit. Like there's no debate about it. The problem is how much better than alternatives. And that's a tough, that depends on the company size, what their goals is, what the product is. So what KMP provides is you're on the best path for Android. There is no better way to write Android application besides using our native toolkit. That's undebatable.
And with KMP, you can still do that.
Yes, with KMP, honestly, one of the best parts of KMP is we actually cannot even easily track who is using KMP because there's no artifact. Like it is no different than...
You have an app that's using KMP, you compile it. If we look at the app in the Play Store, it'll look like a native app because it is a native app. It just happens to have been written to also be able to be cross-compiled to other platforms.
Exactly. So like if for Android, it is zero cost. It's amazing. And it's actually also really, really fast for other platforms too. So it's very competitive. So it gives a very good return on investment for us, because it's good for Android compared to alternatives. It is good for the developer because they could just reuse whatever technology they know.
So I'm assuming we're talking about business logic primarily, right, with KMP?
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct? So I write my code base with KMP. I can compile it to an Android app, and I can also compile it to what else? You mentioned JavaScript earlier. Is JavaScript still relevant for KMP?
I feel like JavaScript is never going to go away. It's like the universal, language of programming. Okay. It will just never die, no matter how much we hate it.
All right. Well, back to Android developers. I'm compiling it. What other compilation targets can I have?
So there's kind of three main stacks, which is web to JavaScript, like you said, and then to Android, and then also to Kotlin native for things like iOS, but also on like Linux or Windows. So those are kind of like the three main branches of all the different compilers they have.
So I take my library that I use on my Android app, and I can also compile it to native code. And that's what? Swift, Objective-C, or actual bytecode? Or .o files, I guess. It's been a while since I've written native code.
The .a file, like the archive files.
Okay.
Technically.
I see. And then I can just put that in an iOS app.
Mm-hmm.
Correct. With steps in between.
All right. What are those steps?
Well, I was gonna say because it depends. So like if you're just shipping like a business logic shared library.
Well, let's take a specific example. Let's say I have a podcast app.
Okay.
What parts of that would be KMP? Like all of it? Would I write all of it in KMP? Or
yeah. So you mentioned like shared business logic, and I want to say like technically that's not really like a KMP limitation. That's more of a Google limitation. Like that's just what we're officially supporting and what we are targeting as the primary use case. But like JetBrains is working on Compose Multiplatform, and there's certainly other KMP UI solutions. So those are things that do exist. So it's not really a limitation of KMP to be only business logic. If you're doing a podcast app, really you can write the whole thing in KMP if you really want to.
But our recommendation, at least what we support today, is shared business logic and then native UI on each platform. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the current model that we're targeting. We think it's the easiest. It's kind of leveraging one of like KMP's main benefits, which is the incremental adoption part. You don't really have to, it's not all or nothing. You can really just do parts of your app if you want to. And I think that's really important for people trying out this kind of technology, because usually it's almost like it's split between whether you're a startup in a small scrappy team and you just want to get something out there quick. And so you'll do the whole app in this sort of multi-platform stack, and then once you're ready to scale up, you'll rewrite it in native.
So is it important then to like design for this up front and make sure the code is sort of separate, or is it easy to restructure code later? Or what would you recommend for someone who's interested in this and want to play with it? Like, and let's say you have an existing app. Let's again take the podcast app example.
Mm.
How do I go about adding what is the verb for turning it into KMP?
So
Campify?
yeah, we call it Campify. But do you already have the app, or this is your like?
This
new
is a made-up
startup?
example. So in my made-up example, I have a podcast app.
No, so you already have the app.
And I'm thinking, hey, this sounds interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I should have an iOS version of this.
Okay, so you don't have the iOS version.
Right.
Okay, so you have an Android-only podcast app.
Yeah.
Amazing. Just stay there. No, not really. We like it to support other platforms. So if you were following the general best practices, it's very likely that in your code base, there's this section what we call at high level business logic. Where's your like database, how you download those podcasts, how you manage their storage.
You're saying I've already structured my app in such a way to make it testable that this is like a separate module. This is to like the data layer.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
module is already inherently business logic-y.
Correct.
Lots
Yeah.
of great words here.
Yeah, I know. The keywords are good. It makes us sound more smart. But basically, so you have that part, and then you already have your UI, right? You do have things like view models that will bring that information to your UI. So if you already written your application that way, basically up until the view model, including the view model, you can take it to iOS as is.
View model is also a business logic concept.
So this is actually where people
Which
get
view
confused.
stuff in
Because-
the business logic.
Yeah. So here's the thing. That's why the reason why people get confused with this is because like, well, you only have it to serve your UI.
Yeah.
But that's actually where most of your actual logic lives in
Yeah.
terms of what do you do if user clicks on something. So it's the lines between business logic and your like UI is actually not that straightforward.
Yeah, maybe we need a better word than business logic.
Yeah, we were actually our Kotlin PM is working on like trying to express this better because it's like, so if you think about your database, your obviously business logic and your composables on the screen, sure they're not. But then there is like, what was that thing called? The molecule? The compose architecture library? Not ours. What's that called?
There's a whole bunch, but
Yeah,
I know
so
what
like
you're thinking.
one of those libraries that use compose engine to run your application logic, that kind of also business logic. There's no UI there, even though that is very tightly integrated with your presentation. So you cannot like just separate them left and right. There's a transition, and we want KMP to involve that transition layer, which we'll call view model or, whatever you have in your application. But ideally, you can take all of that, compile to iOS, and then take your Swift UI, wrap it up, and you're good to go.
I see. So in practice, let's pretend that I had nice separation of logic and this layer. I would then switch the project type from like Android library to like KMP library. Is that what it means? Like switching some Gradle plugins around, and now there's different build targets and it's going to create different artifacts. Is that how it works?
In an ideal world.
In an ideal world.
Yeah, and really the switch is you just change the plugin from the regular Kotlin Gradle plugin to the multi-platform one. And then there's a couple Gradle DSL changes, but for the most part it's quite similar. And then you have to think about, is your source fully commonized?
Well, I guess I'm assuming that if I were to do that first step and then I compile, I'll find out.
Pretty much, yeah.
Right. So I'll compile and I'll see some class that I've used. I've used some API. Let's say it's an Android X API maybe or something, right? That is binding to something that's not available in common Kotlin. Then I get a compilation error. What's a common example that you've seen of the kind of thing people will do that you need to like commonize? Is that another verb we're using here?
Yeah, that's the one I've been using.
So common is that is what we're calling business logic?
No. Common is just a common between platforms you target. Common doesn't necessarily mean for all platforms. It means for the platforms you target. So if you're only targeting, let's say, iOS and Android, common for you means that supports Android and iOS.
Are there parts of KMP that are like that are like, this is common to Android and iOS, but not those targets?
That's actually the best part of KMP. So let's say, well, you're an Android Studio developer, right? So JVM is important for you. So maybe when you want to have your podcast app to also be a plugin for Android Studio, so you can also listen in your Android Studio for some reason. Well, you can just use your Java APIs that are available on the JVM and the Android runtime in your common code because they're common for you. So what really matters is where you're trying to compile your code.
Well, I'm assuming the common case maybe was going to be iOS and Android for a lot of our, Android developers, right? What is the common surface there? Like, what are some APIs that are? I'm assuming that we have like list and string and all those things already, right? But that's not going to be Java lang string for iOS.
Yeah, so it kind of depends on what things you depend on and what things you pull in. I think for a lot of people writing pure Kotlin for like just for Java for JVM and Android, one of the benefits of Kotlin is its great ability with Java interop, right? And so you tend to use a lot of Java APIs without realizing it. And so it's mostly just switching over to using Kotlin APIs or Kotlin equivalents. And then almost all the time, those will be written in a commonized way so that they're not also dependent on other Java APIs. But really, it's totally dependent on what dependencies you pull in. And then for the libraries you do pull in, what targets they build to.
Well, I mean, setting the libraries aside, I'm assuming, for example, older code might be using like the Java IO file reader. Mm-hmm. And what you want to do is just switch it to like Kotlin file, read text or read bytes or whatever. And then it'll automatically, magically already have a binding that works for
So iOS. You will definitely, at least at this stage, so this is a developing ecosystem, right? At this stage, you will hit some problems like the file. There is actually no common file API in Kotlin standard library. Now, we have been working with JetBrains to accelerate the Kotlin X IO library that's supposed to solve that problem. There is OKIO from Square that already supports it, so you're not without solutions.
Yeah, OKIO is pretty popular. The impression I see that in a lot of sample projects. And
we actually use it. So one of our libraries, Jetpack Data Store, which is like a simple data persistence solution. It does use OKIO for cross-platform solutions. But that doesn't mean we still let you use Java file on Android. That's one of the nicest things about KMP. It doesn't lock you into cross-platform solutions.
It sounds very flexible.
So Kotlin XIO, I think, does have file now, but in a much more limited way than Java does. And the goal, just to be clear, the goal of the project is to eventually graduate these APIs to the standard lib. So they're just like.
I'm sorry, which APIs?
In the Kotlin XIO library that you just
Kotlin XIO. Okay.
Yeah. So that has a lot of like sources and syncs and ways to read and write and do IO and how to deal with paths and things like that. So the goal is to bake it in that library and then eventually graduate it to standard lib because it is really something that should just live in the standard library. But IO is
files are super important, but also, I mean, from working on desktop software, right? Like Windows, and it's so different when it comes to files. And even though like there's like a single API for this continues to just be difficult to tests are always flaking and having issues with like file encodings and paths and things like that.
I think this is why JetBrains took a long time to kick the can down the road to deal with IO, is because the way like files are treated on different platforms are actually like at the high level, it feels mostly the same, but then once you actually try and implement it, the behavior is very like specific and different. Like file locking is.
I'm mainly familiar with the desktop cases, right? But as in Android, of course, there's all kinds of issues with files, right? Because you don't want to let the app just access the entire file system for user privacy reasons, right? So there's all those other things too, and I'm assuming you want KMP to be aware of these things, being able to get access and ask the user for permission and things like that. That's got to be tricky to address. Yeah.
That's actually one of the reasons we have been wanting to invest in KMP, because if you feel like if you don't, and you get a Java developer like yourself, like doing desktop applications, writes a KMP library.
I say Kotlin developer for desktop applications.
Sorry. Apologies. Kotlin developer like yourself, but mainly writes desktop applications, who doesn't necessarily create let's take another person, okay? You may not think about the things like content providers, file access, like restricted storage. You might just create a simple file library, assume it's good enough, and ship it.
Yeah.
we don't want that to happen to Android. Like Android did suffer from other cross-platform frameworks where they didn't really handle the permissions properly on Android, and that hurts our devices, that affects our users, reduces the developer experience and the user experience. So I want to make sure the KMP libraries are like really, really good on Android and as good as possible on other platforms we support. We do spend significant time figuring that out as well.
Yeah, asking for permission just in time when the permission request makes sense is very useful to users, but it makes API design much harder. And so I can see that being, thinking about that when you're designing an API like this is really important.
And I think what makes our life really hard in converting libraries to Kotlin Multiplatform is the API design, especially the APIs we have already designed.
Yeah.
Now you want to...
Because you're going back into your old libraries and going like, let's campify this.
Yeah.
And then you're like, uh-oh, this is accessing Android.graphics.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's not the accessing part is okay. If it is part of the public API, you just cannot remove it. So it's when we were starting Kotlin Multiplatform, like 5 years ago, we set some ground rules, and one of them that was like, you just cannot reduce the Android experience, period. So if you had an API that received Java file, that API will stay there. If you redid that API from scratch, maybe you would never create it, but it is there, it needs to be supported. And then that makes it really hard because now you basically have to create a duplicate API.
And you want to sort of steer people away from the legacy one that you maybe don't want to deprecate. Or maybe you do. I don't know.
I mean,
we care a lot about compatibility almost to a fault on Android.
I don't think anyone who's an Android developer will fault you for caring about compatibility. This.
Yeah, you don't have to rewrite your code, write your whole code base every 2 years. This is also kind of like why we're trying to like go through and campify all the existing stuff. We're really looking at what is most used today and go through those and just make them KMP compatible so that you kind of get KMP for free without having to really remove a lot of stuff out of your existing app. And the dream scenario is like you have to make no changes and then one day there's a checkbox and you can just click compile my Android app to iOS and then it just works. But like you said, it's problematic because if we have public APIs that call into Android APIs or expose Android platform constructs, then we can't really remove those or change those. So then it becomes hard. Then you have to have a separate API.
And for listeners though, like if you are an application owner, your life is good. You don't need to support APIs. Like you can do major changes. And I played this a little bit, didn't go very well, but I do believe once we get enough data, on Android Studio, Ask Gemini, convert this to KMP is going to be a possibility. We will get there.
It's been my impression so far that those kinds of migrations, the AI can do a really good job today. Like the things that are hard, like the thing that everyone wants us to do is like convert my view-space app to Compose. This turns out to be extremely hard because it's usually not a file-by-file conversion. It's like the whole architecture has to change. It's like you've already spread out your logic into an XML file. There's some fine view by IDs and some other class. Maybe that's been abstracted. This is hard. But when you have like a single file, like convert this file to that, this AI can do pretty well today. So for example, converting from like Groovy files to KTS files works really, really well. Yeah. And I'd have to play with it, but I wouldn't be surprised if offering, some sort of Gemini conversion to KMP seems doable, at least when there is a clear mapping. And maybe that's my next question about libraries, right? Like I can see how for files we can solve it and for some of the built-in data types. What about all the other stuff that my app is doing, right? So let's say my app is, doing something on Android to like scan Wi-Fi. What do I do? What's the, like my podcast app, let's say it's doing something with Wi-Fi, right? It's trying to like do some clever, smart downloading feature, detecting if you have a slow network, I'm going to go to this other feed, making this up on the fly. And I compile and it says, I can't access Android.Wi-Fi manager in KMP. What is the
So right now, I'll take it. I don't know if you want to take it.
No, you could take it.
Okay, I'll take it. First of all, ideally, you don't do that on Android. You just use Work Manager.
Work Manager can tell me about network congestion.
I mean, it wouldn't tell you about network congestion, but if you're a podcast app, you're probably just trying to download things. Tell Work Manager.
No. My pro feature here, right, is that it detects that you're out bicycling, and you forgot the next episode, but it was a longer bicycle ride, and then we can find this, but we're going to detect that your network is slow,
wow.
And so we're going to get this lower bitrate thing for you.
I see. Okay.
This is what the Netflix app.
Yeah, I like a streaming case. Yeah, we don't have an out of the box solution for that
in Work Manager.
In Work Manager.
Yeah.
This is not a Work Manager case. But let's say you try to compile that code for iOS, and then it's just not going to find it. It's going to give you an error.
Yeah.
I do think what you will end up doing is so Kotlin Multiplatform has this expect actual functionality where you declare something like an interface in your common code and implement
This is an actual language feature now.
Yeah, it's a language feature. Yeah. So an Android implementation will just going to be the same. I think you can just copy the Android implementation to iOS, try to compile. It will give you an error. You pass that to Gemini, tell you are trying to campify this code. Gemini is going to say, I think it's called AF Network Foundation, the iOS APIs. It will just convert it for you. You can wipe code a lot of this, even today.
All right. I did not anticipate this was going to be talking about vibe coding, but all right. We're very timely. Yeah. So you're saying, but actually, I actually agree with you. Maybe not on the having it implemented, but absolutely, asking it how to implement this on iOS is probably going to be, pretty good start.
No, it is.
So the sorry for interrupting, but the expect actuals is kind of like old header files in native code, right? I'm basically saying, here's the header file for this, and I will provide one at link time.
Exactly.
Right. So on the link implementation for Android is directly pass through the Wi-Fi Manager API. So I have to make a new set of APIs. I have to make a new header file, a new interface for what Wi-Fi Manager gave me.
Mm-hmm.
And only for that subset that I care about, I would abstract out. I then stub that in and point directly to Wi-Fi Manager on Android. And on iOS, I'm like, okay, I basically asked Gemini, how do I implement this API on iOS? And it might just tell me, there's this thing to call.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying.
It'll get you 90% there. And the key here, what sets KMP apart is you don't need to wait someone else to write the network library so you can make this cross-platform. You can just call the Apple Foundation APIs from your Kotlin code. That is the kind of the killer feature of KMP. You don't wait for someone to write you a wrapper to call platform APIs.
You're saying I don't have to write this. I don't have to learn Objective-C to write that implementation.
No.
I would write that also in Kotlin,
Correct.
but that's Kotlin native compiling against OS 10 APIs or iOS APIs.
Objective-C, just like how we have Java interop in Kotlin, there is also Objective-C interop, and I believe there's been a lot of demand for Swift interop, so I'm sure that's on the line, that's in the timeline somewhere, but it's similar, yeah. So Kotlin will generate Kotlin bindings for Objective-C APIs for you, and that's how you can call into iOS Foundation APIs on Kotlin.
So I was expecting an answer when I asked about libraries, okay, how do we do library hunting? You're like, just roll your own. Why use a library?
Yeah, you're not blocked. Yeah. So why use a library? There's a couple years ago, I was talking to one of the well-known companies, and they wanted to move to KMP, but their major problem was they're already using certain libraries. So if they want to convert their application to KMP, now they need to find a replacement or rewrite those parts. And I was actually, they were specifically asking about Room. Can you just make it multi-platform so we don't need to migrate to another database library? So because you already use libraries for Android, you will tend to keep using libraries.
Yeah.
But
so did we?
Oh, yeah. It's actually... By the time this podcast comes out, we should have the Room's KMP compatible version out. I think it's 2.7.
I think so, yeah.
Out in stable or out in Canary?
Yeah, it's going to be stable.
Stable. Even better. So how many of the Android X libraries or maybe not how many, what percentage of the Android X libraries are KMP compatible today?
It's generally, so we have like, in Jetpack, we have like something like 800 libraries or something that we ship. I forget how many. It's like hundreds.
Yeah.
And not all of them make sense in KMP. A lot of them are very, very Android specific. I will say the ones we are targeting are sort of the more architecture components ones that have high levels of adoption and have a lot of call sites throughout your code.
Yeah, again, this goes back to like we're really focusing on the business logic parts.
Right. And yeah, and at first we started with like simple libraries just to get our feet wet with like things like annotations and collections, but it's really just like a handful right now, and there's a lot more to go. I mean, Room you mentioned, we have Data Store, that's the other kind of big one. Paging is kind of KMP. It's KMP, but it doesn't ship with like a UI binding for Swift UI. So you have to write the last piece yourself, or you can use squares if you want. So
Square has implemented something that works with our paging library.
So they have a like paging KMP library that is highly inspired by our paging library.
Okay, but it's separate. Okay.
I think it's a fork.
Is it a fork?
It's
Okay,
a
it might be
fork.
just a fork.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
just a fork.
But they eventually wanted to try to upstream some of that back in.
Nice.
So a lot of the core logic now is all commonized. It's really just the last bit to hook into Swift UI.
So what is the biggest one we're missing?
Good question.
Okay, or like by votes or
Yes.
complaints on Slack or whatever. Like, what is the one that is like, oh man, how
The
embarrassing.
top requests that I've been seeing are Firebase, which is a huge suite of libraries there. Yeah, and then there's Dagger is also highly requested, seems. Although Metro just came out, so maybe it won't be so requested anymore.
Don't we have one for? We have Hilt, right? Which is like a Dagger
For Android.
like a mobile optimized one. Is that one KMP and not enabled?
No, because it depends on Dagger. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, it doesn't.
I mean,
wouldn't-
we are working with the Dagger team on Dagger. It is just priorities.
Is that a scoop?
I don't know. I mean, it's public scoop, right? Is this insider scoop? I don't think we need to cut this part. It's not that surprising, right? Like when we asked the developers, the surprising one for me was Work Manager.
Yes, that was.
I didn't expect to see Work Manager on top of that list of remaining libraries.
Well, by your earlier thing where like you said that when you click on something that business logic should be in this layer, I can imagine that you want to enqueue it. Like this is a task I want to start, right? So I can see why you want Work Manager in your business layer.
Yeah, and I think a part of this is also like adoption related, like libraries, Work Manager, Room. These libraries have like 90% plus adoption rate. Just pretty much everybody uses them. They become your blocker.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily you're like hoping to use them, but also. Like when we try to convert libraries, we have to take a very like bottoms up approach. We need to convert like collections, annotations, the testing library,
Well,
a bunch
gets
of the
easier and
lifecycle
easier,
libraries.
right? As you,
Yeah.
every new library, you've done more of the dependencies.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's our primary focus, and I believe we are at a point where we wouldn't be your blocker if you are trying to campify your application. Like I think we do have a decent set of libraries that will unblock you to use KMP. But there's still a lot to do.
Nice.
I think a huge reason why something like Work Manager is highly requested is probably because, one, it's the high adoption, like you mentioned, but two, it's also, I think the platform bindings are a little bit harder to write. Like you need a little bit of iOS expertise. And I do think there is going to be a huge demand for developers who are deeply familiar with multiple platforms. I think that's a really difficult skill. Usually you can find developers who are very good at either Android or very good at iOS, like specialists. But to find someone who is good at both and maybe also web is very, very difficult. So that's kind of like, I don't know, like I'm not trying to give career advice, but you kind of see the same thing on React Native too, right? It's really, there's a lot of jobs for the junior folks who just greenfield and build whatever and make it work. And then there's also like a huge demand for people who are able to write these super complex platform bindings. And we're trying to do a lot of the heavy lifting for the KMP side within the Android team by tackling some of these harder ones like, I won't say that we're working on work manager, but things like Dagger. I'm sweating here because I'm not supposed to promise.
That's
yeah.
work.
We're thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely on our radar. It's something we want to do. It's highly ubiquitous library that's hugely adopted and has code throughout your entire code base.
Yeah.
And it's not easy to move. Yeah.
I think like libraries are just part of the equation though. Like your experience on the Gradle side, we have done a lot of work there, and there's still a lot to do to improve that conversion experience.
Yeah, let's talk about the whole developer experience.
Mm-hmm. And Android Studio, if you know somebody there, they can.
Those people are hard to reach.
They are.
Yeah. So I think that in the latest version of Studio, there's now a template,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the idea is you have your Android project and you can create a new KMP module. And this is like common, right? This is where you put business logic that you intend to also run on iOS
Mm-hmm.
or web or whatever. And so you can build. Can you debug? Like what things is there anything that's degraded? Like, is there any reason if I'm not yet targeting iOS with my podcast app,
Mm-hmm.
but I've already done the clean architecture,
Mm-hmm.
you probably would recommend that I switch to KMP now, right? So I don't add future debt, right, by accidentally using non-KMP.
Yeah, if you have a KMP library that only targets Android, there's nothing different. It's just an Android library pretty much with a different build DSL. So
would you recommend that I switch? Or
you wouldn't gain too much. Like the challenges or the nice things. We had this when we were converting Android X to KMP. Just moving your code to common, again, doesn't make it common. If you are only targeting Android, it just gets compiled with the Android APIs. This is a little bit changing in K2, but fundamentally, unless you start compiling it for iOS, you're not going to realize that you're using Android APIs.
So I think I missed something important. Like I had assumed that if I make a module and I apply like the KMP plugin instead of the Android library, I had assumed that I'm no longer getting Android.jar on the class path. I was assuming I was only going to see Kotlin. And so if I access anything from Android, it would complain.
No, so you need to add platforms.
So there is no like common target. There is no like common Kotlin compiler that compiles to common Kotlin.
I see. So you're saying it's going to compile it on each one. And
Exactly.
so on Android, it'll be fine.
Exactly.
And the second I try to compile it on something else, and that is I'm understanding now, because that is why you're like, hey, they just have to have some overlap. So as long as all the platforms I compiled all provide that API, I'm good.
Yeah. I mean, so with K2 is actually, there has been some back and forth because there is an intention, there's this Kotlin metadata compilation for your common code. So there is actually something that tries to compile it just for Kotlin, but it is not that straightforward. I don't exactly know where it ended right now, but let's say if you want to move to KMP, you need to add the iOS target, then you will benefit. So every code you write is just completely possible there. But for the studio experience, I think there's still, like with Fleet, you can get a decent experience where you can mix your Swift UI. So you're writing an iOS app, right? You do have Swift UI, and you are using your Android View model in that Swift UI. And you can just navigate between them. That's super nice. Like Android Studio right now doesn't know your Swift code, or if you are running a test on your iOS simulator, you can run the test, but you cannot debug it in Android Studio.
I see.
Those are my feature requests for someone if you know in Studio that can help prioritize.
I mean, the Studio debugger doesn't work for on iOS, but you can still do things like you can symbolicate crashes and stuff, so you don't see your stack traces aren't a total garbled mess or anything like that. You can actually point to the correct line in Kotlin where it's broken, and so there are things to help with that, but it's not.
Well, I'm assuming that the developer experience, if we are again providing a business logic library compiled to Objective-C or Swift or whatever .a. And then you would have to be probably in Xcode or Fleet, right, to build the Swift, to build a native UI for iOS and the rest of the application, and then just link into this library.
Mm-hmm.
And I would assume that the debugger over there would work. So it's just that in Studio, you do not have an iOS experience. Here you get to develop your library and test it with Android.
Yes, and this is kind of the expected thing too. Maybe this is a good segue, but basically, like I think there's like some confusion about how KMP means iOS developers have to interact with Kotlin. I think it depends a bit on your team size.
Well, will they know? Like they're just going to see compiled code, right? Does it look generated or does it look clean and beautiful?
Well, it's compiled code, so they don't even really see it. They just kind of see the imports and the APIs that are available.
Yeah. Does that look good, or is it? I know in Kotlin you can tell from Java. It has like the KT suffix on a lot of the classes if you aren't careful, right? Like, does it have that kind of a smell? Would this turn off the rest of the iOS team?
Well, it depends how good the library developer is, I guess. So that's kind of part of it too. Like there are some things that I think JetBrains is still working on, like proper Swift interop, so you get like native coroutines translating properly between both. But there are also like frameworks like Sky, for example, is something TouchLab has built, which will help you generate better, more native feeling Swift bindings on top of what Kotlin compiler normally spits out.
Yeah, I'm assuming like the naming conventions are probably different, right? I know when I look at Objective-C code, it feels very foreign to me, just in terms of the way things are named and the capitalization. Yeah. I forget now, right? But don't they use like some capitals and a lot of the names?
Yeah, everything is top level, so they have like a little tag in front of each coder.
And I'm assuming that wouldn't happen in my business logic unless there's a way to say put this prefix on every class or something, right?
So there's lots of like annotations like that that like allow you as a library developer or if you're just developing shared business logic to change the names of your variables on
also
different
a bit
platforms.
like the @JVM name you can
you can just an @JS name and an
or you can like hide it from Objective-C if you don't want it to be visible there, but it needs to be public for some other reason.
It's pretty nice. So if you put some care into the API and you get some feedback from your colleagues, you can hide the fact that this is actually written in Kotlin.
Yeah, ideally it's a little bit complicated now, but it is possible. And I believe like the Swift interop is already in the roadmap they announced.
Yes.
That will make life better, but like definitely Sky from TouchLab, like we use it on our official samples.
Okay.
It's just I think the main problem Sky solves is coroutines and flow. So you can collect your Kotlin coroutines as, I forgot what they were called on iOS. Async sequences, if I'm not mistaken.
They have their own.
And then
just coroutines. So.
And then we wrote the part to make them lifecycle aware. You can actually use Android lifecycle components in iOS, and it's actually like very neat. We have been working on this for a long time, and it's actually coming together very well. So that makes me very happy.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's compelling. So I think we are using this in some Google products. What have we talked about publicly?
So mostly it's just, I think it's Google Workspace right now.
So that's like Google
Docs.
Drive, Docs.
So Google Docs is the first one, mostly because I think it was the easiest. And then I think they'll be experimenting with other ones down the line. But Google Docs right now, I think, is already in production in iOS.
Yeah. Wow. And I'm assuming also Android because it's just Android.
Yes, of course. So the whole app compiled through KMP on production in iOS. Not at 100% yet, I think. It's rolling out slowly, but it's a pretty huge achievement. And then also they're able to get like field metrics for like performance and stuff, and those numbers are looking pretty good. Surprisingly to me also. I was like ready for like Armageddon when those numbers came out.
They are looking better than their Objective-C numbers, just to be clear when we say, but like, I mean, it depends. There's hundreds of metrics.
Yeah.
Some of them are like impressively good.
Yeah, it maybe part of that is also because their Objective-C code wasn't like maybe as optimized as it could be, but I mean, it's Google Docs. There's a ton of engineers working on it, and there's a lot of people already working on performance, so it's not like there's tons of low-hanging fruit that's easy to solve either. But I mean, to be clear, like when he says on par or better, it's like within a few points, like within a few %. And this is runtime performance. I think memory usage is like slightly up because of the GC, but it's like 10% or less.
Yeah.
And they're still working on that. And a big benefit of having large app adoption like Google Workspace, I really think it's super important for any technology's like survival, is to have big company adoption. I think it's almost like more important than how good the technology itself is. Like, look at JavaScript. Like, it's objectively terrible, but I mean, but
I always call it bytecode of the browser, right? Like,
yeah, it's like this interpreted language that needs like 50 compilers, but it's it's universal. Like, it's stood the test of time, and it's because every company is built on top of it, and it's been the language of the web forever. And if you want to do something on web, you have to do it in JavaScript, and that's just how it is. And because all these companies are investing into it, they're also investing into the language and the tooling and the platform itself to make it better. And that's really important for the longevity of any technology. And so,
but you're not saying KMP sucks.
No, I'm not. I mean,
No.
what I'm saying is
it's got its own merits, but it's also great that it's gonna.
I mean, everything can always be better. But my point is that it's important to have something like Google Workspace adopting KMP because it means that we have people who are contributing back towards the Kotlin native compiler. You know, we rewrote a new version of the garbage collector, a new version of the memory allocator because we wanted to make it faster. And we have expertise from people who work on Android runtime to work on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think there are a number of external companies who are also using it. We probably don't want to like speak for them, but I think they've been public about it as well, right? So it's there's adoption here.
I mean, and also like in terms of like it's a shiny technology, but it has to be proven. Like that was very important for us early on. Like how do we validate actually? When was it, like 2021 or 2020? It was like when Dustin and Luke knows.
Oh, Luke knows.
It was
Yeah,
like two engineers from Workspace and Dustin from our side, like just started playing with the technology, like stress testing it, because now we know it works for Workspace. We know it will scale to Google.
Yeah,
like that's a huge confidence that is not going to be something where it only works for toy apps or small apps. No, like we know it works for top apps, and it's a good long-term investment for Google, Android. So I feel a lot more confident now than I was 2 years ago.
You seem pretty confident then.
Yes, it's the fake it until you make it part, but I think we made it now.
I also think this is like almost a unique feature of KMP compared to like other multi-platform, just because it's almost like I feel like a lot of the adoption on things like Flutter, React Native, and then like Cordova, others have always been greenfield small startups. They have a small team. They just want to create a prototype and get it out there with limited resources. But the use case we're actually targeting is you're a large app and you don't want to have meetings about how your model is going to slightly change every week now. And so why not just make that into a commonized library? And you can do that incrementally, and it's on top of the native Android stack. And so it's not like you need to train a new set of developers to learn this new language. It is a unique skill set where you need to like add additional knowledge, but you can build on top of an existing foundation. I think that's
you have a
unique.
single set of tests for both platforms, which is also nice.
Yes, yeah, you can dedupe a lot of code, which is amazing for just general sanity. But it's actually also the communication cost between organizations. Like, backend team releases this new version of the API where they add a new flag. Is the flag a long or an int? How many?
Yeah.
It's like, is it and people get bugs with this kind of stuff like all the time. And if you can just merge it into one place so you don't have that communication cost anymore, that is an overall win. I mean, of course, KMP can also still do the greenfield and prototype stuff, and that's always what multi-platform's good at. But the fact that we're also able to target this use case, I think, is a pretty big game changer.
Yeah. What did I forget to ask?
You opened the podcast with like why, what's the sales pitch for KMP, and I tried to say like why we're doing it for Android developers, but really I do feel like it's sorry, I'm just ranting now. Really I do feel like it's like kind of like the holy grail of modern software. Like if you look at TypeScript, Swift, Kotlin, like all the new languages that people are adopting on these platforms, they're getting like closer and closer. If you look at React Native adoption, it is increasing. It's not dying. Like the desire for multi-platform tech is there. The way people think about programming in general is getting more and more similar. We're less and less. You're making a face. Maybe you don't believe me.
It's just I think I'm hearing the echo of Pole.
Oh, okay. Maybe you don't believe me here. This is a stretch. I don't know. It is a bet. It's a long-term bet. I don't think it's like a for sure thing, but I think it's definitely something worthwhile pursuing. And if we succeed this time, then we'll have changed how the way people like do software for forever.
Well, the pitch is that you get to, write it and have it apply multiple places, but it's actually native in one place, right? Usually a lot of the other alternatives, it's a layer. It's not native anywhere. And that is amazing here, right? It's that your app will be 100% native Android. And then a lot of stuff is also reusable on iOS. And in theory, if you pick the right libraries, you could even have the same code on both.
I mean, I don't want to understand, like, it does definitely bring new challenges because of that interop. There is complications that you need to account for. Like, we had this problem, you're converting our some truth tests to support JavaScript and WASM. Like, WASM is pretty good on JavaScript. Well, everything is a number, and number doesn't hold 64 bits, so your longs are actually two numbers. Like, there is going to, but I think that will pretty much only affect library developers, and once that ecosystem is built, so you pay something for that nice interoperability.
That's an interesting question. I remember, I think Java tried very hard to be the same behavior everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And they paid some heavy prices for that.
Mm-hmm.
Because, for example, on math, you wanted to guarantee, I forgot which math operation it was, but they couldn't use the OS native primitives because there were platform-specific differences. And they wanted to make sure that a calculation would be the same everywhere. So it was like a software implementation of some expensive math operations. And I think that, I don't know if it was like an Android thing or more of a library thing. But I remember like, someone switching over to primitives to get much better performance, even though it did mean that it was different. And I'm assuming with KMP, what is the philosophy there? Is it like close but give the native behavior, or is it like predictable behavior across platforms? From what you said about JavaScript, I have a sense it's going to be calling the native thing. It's not going to be trying to simulate. You're not going to use like big decimal behind the scenes in order to get like that 64-bit representation, for example, right? At a horrible runtime performance cost.
So this is an interesting line that I think we also talked to JetBrains a lot about this, but it's really difficult to find the line of like, when do we want behavior to be the same, and when do we want to just optimize for compatibility? And my personal opinion is that probably in most cases, compatibility with existing behavior is the most important because it's just too disruptive.
I just want to make sure, when you say compatibility, you mean compatibility with the platform or across platforms? Compatible across platforms, or like with what happens?
So with what happens
back to the math
currently
example
today, as in like instead of trying to define a new standard, just calling into what happens on each platform and just being okay with the behavior diverging.
Okay, yeah.
But there's a line. It's like, if it diverges too much, then it's noticeable and you have to like change the way you actually code around it. But if it's something like,
I mean, that goes back to our Java IO file discussion from earlier.
Yes,
like they just chose like, we'll do whatever the platform does. So there's different path separators and different line encodings, and it's actually a pain to deal with as an application developer.
Yeah, and it's a bit about like API design too. Like when we're designing the IO APIs, can we just do a subset and not promise the same, functionality? Like the Java file APIs all have file locking and stuff. They have like object owners and everything, and you can do like exclusive rights and all that. And that is not easy to guarantee the same behavior across platforms. And a lot of times it's actually like not even possible. It's like a best effort by the kernel. And so it's almost better to delegate that to existing behavior. And, I think if we were to change it, it not only would be like a lot of work that wouldn't be worth it, but also it would be disruptive to like existing apps out there and existing code bases.
Yeah, and then like think about it, right? Like you don't want it Kotlin running on Android suddenly change behavior to be compatible with what is supposed to do on another platform.
Right.
But I think the right thing here is that consistency is important, but it's kind of a little bit case by case. When we faced this problem in Jetpack so far, we try to create explicit APIs to like, well, the API available on iOS is actually different because you don't need to have the same API surface.
Yeah.
So if on iOS or on Android, if you need to call this API with a context, well, we only have that API. We are not going to just get a string and try to assume location.
Yeah.
Because we want it to look like Android when you are using it from Android. When you are using it from iOS, look more like iOS.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Any call to action? Anything you want the listeners who are interested in this to, I guess you said you have a talk coming up.
Yeah, so we're doing we'll have an I/O talk, so we'll have some presence at I/O. It is more of like a beginner talk, like just a breakdown of the build and also a little bit of like overview and where we're going with KMP and what we're working on within Android. But if people are at KotlinConf, I'll be there. We'll have a code lab running. We have a room, I think, and we'll be helping people set up their apps for KMP if you want. And if you have bugs or crashes, I'm happy to debug your app, I guess. But there'll also be other people there. There's a bunch of Googlers giving talks. So we do have conference presence, and we'll be around. And if you have questions, we're happy to ask. But also, if you have feedback, there are. I don't know what the best way to provide a link is, but if you go to like.
We can put your phone number in the show notes, right?
Yeah, everyone can just text me directly.
I call him after work hours. I don't want him to be disrupted during work.
So we use Buganizer for issue tracking, but if you go to like developer.android.com/Kotlin/multiplatform, I think at the bottom of the page there's a link to it. That's probably the easiest way I can give a link.
Yeah. I think that the important thing is like so far we've been very much focused on validation. Let's be confident, and like we get there now, especially with like. Google Docs shipping is a very good bar. And this year we want to start looking at, how do we make it easier to adopt? Like understand the user journey better. So if you're trying, just reach out to us. Like both Dustin and myself are very easy to find on the internet. Like reach out to us, share your experiences. We've been actively started talking to companies, how their adoption journey. Like so far we have not been focused on adoption at all. But this year we are slowly starting that, so we would like to hear people's stories. So we prioritize accordingly, focus on the important things.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.